Good morning. Question for you parents. So Christmas is coming up, right? 1 week away. Any of you feeling any pressure that on Christmas morning you didn't nail it? Anybody feeling the pressure that just worried that you didn't nail it when it comes to the Christmas gifts? Or especially if you have more than one kid and you're just not sure whether or not one's going to be really happy and the other one isn't. Isn't it funny how that oftentimes kind of works out on Christmas? Maybe you've experienced that yourself, even as a grown person, right? You go home for Christmas and you see what maybe mom and dad got for your brother or sister, and then what they got for you. It's like, a lot of times if we just took at face value something that was given to us, maybe there'd be a great deal of appreciation for it until we see maybe what was given to somebody else, right? And then all of a sudden we start comparing, thinking about what that person could have given me if they had wanted to, or what they gave me in comparison to someone else. Well, I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. There's actually a story in the Bible where some comparisons are being made. First of all, we have a human being comparing himself to another human being, and then Jesus coming in and kind of reinterpreting and I think giving a better comparison of what's really going on there. So if you have your Bibles, I'm in Luke chapter 7. Verses 36 through 50, we're going to read this story. I think it relates, somewhat to Christmas, the Christmas season. I'll try to kind of make that connection here later on, but really I want to look at, what is, as we've been doing throughout this series, taking these little parables, these little object lessons that Jesus uses to illustrate some truth, see how that might apply to us today. All right, so Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. The scene is this: Jesus is going to have dinner at a Pharisee's house. Okay, one of the religious leaders has invited Jesus to come and have a meal with him, and so that's kind of where this whole story takes place. All right, so verse 36. Then one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to eat with them, and so Jesus entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And a woman in the town who was a sinner found out that Jesus was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, and so she brought an alabaster jar of perfume and stood behind him at his feet, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears. She wiped his feet with her hair, kissing them and anointing them with the perfume. Now, if you're trying to get the picture of what's happening here, it might be a little difficult because the way in which these meals are taken in Jesus' time, very different from how we're going to do it. As we get together as a family, you're gonna sit around a table or a couple tables. Your family's so big, maybe you have a kid's table. But we're gonna sit around a table. Our feet are gonna be tucked underneath our chairs and the tables. But in Jesus' day and culture, people would actually kind of recline at the table. Another weird thing is just the fact that Jesus is having dinner at this person's house and in walks some strange woman. I don't know if you're counting on that happening on Christmas morning. You're there. Somebody's getting ready to carve the turkey. Did we do turkey at the Christmas? I can't remember. I don't know. Whatever it is that you're eating, right? So somebody's getting ready to do the ceremonial slicing of whatever chunk of meat you got going on there on Christmas morning, and all of a sudden the door just opens and in walks some stranger, right, and starts in effect participating in your Christmas dinner. That'd be really weird, but it wasn't so weird. I mean, there was much more of an open door policy. In fact, when you'd have somebody as important as Jesus coming to have a meal at somebody as important as this guy Simon, this Pharisee, this religious leader at his house, there would be some who would be there to observe. So in comes this woman, and she, Jesus' feet are kind of behind him because, again, he's reclined at the table, right? And so the scene is this. She gets down by his feet. She begins sobbing, right? Weeping. So much so that her tears begin to drench the feet of Jesus, the exposed feet of Jesus. Jesus isn't wearing shoes, probably even sandals at this point. I'm sure they've been checked at the door. So there Jesus is with his bare feet. She's at his feet, weeping, sobbing at his feet. And she begins drying his feet with her hair, kissing his feet and anointing them with that alabaster bottle of perfume that she had brought with her. She's pouring them onto Jesus' feet. Well, the Pharisee noticed this, no surprise. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, right? So this scene is taking place, and the Pharisee is sitting there at the table, probably assuming what Jesus would do, how Jesus would react to this whole thing. But Jesus didn't respond. Jesus didn't react in the way that Simon had assumed. And so Simon says to himself, he was at least smart enough to keep his thoughts inside his head for a moment. But he says to himself, this man, Jesus, if he were a prophet, right? So Simon himself he's wondering, he's unsure of who, exactly Jesus is. He maybe by inviting Jesus into his home, trying to take steps toward better understanding who it is this Jesus is that all this hubbub is about. But now given that his assumptions don't play out as he thought they would, now he is making judgments upon Jesus if he were a prophet. In other words, now I can see that this man Jesus is not a prophet, is basically what he's saying. If he were a prophet, he would know who and what kind of woman this is who's touching him, right? This isn't just any woman. This isn't a woman of high regard. This is not a woman that was highly esteemed in society. She is not one that, as she walked the streets, people just were sort of mesmerized by her appearance, her persona, her charisma. No, this is, if I could put it delicately, this is a woman of the city, if you know what I mean. And so he says Jesus would know who and what kind of woman that is touching him. She's a sinner, right? Simon knew who she was. Everybody knew who she was, right? So this is going on in his heart quietly. Jesus breaks the silence. He replies, it's interesting, he replies to Simon. Simon hasn't even said anything, right? But Jesus knows exactly what is occurring in the thoughts in Simon's heart. He says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And so Simon said, say it, teacher. And then Jesus begins this parable, very short parable, okay? This we're going to kind of talk about this morning. So Jesus says this to Simon. Simon, there was a creditor. He had two debtors, one who owed 500 denarii and the other 50. Now, the monetary unit that a denarii represents is about a day's wages for a laborer. And so on the one hand, there's a debtor who owes about whatever 500 days worth of work would be valued at, and the other owes 50, just 10% of what the first one owes. Since they could not pay it back, that's important, right? Both of these debtors could not pay back. The one could not pay back the 500, the other could not pay back the 50, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. He, the creditor, graciously forgave them both. So, and here's the question, right? Given that scenario, which of them will love him more? Which of these two debtors will love the creditor who has forgiven their debt more? Simon answered, I suppose the one he forgave more, right? In other words, the one that owed 500, I suppose that one would love him more than the one who had been forgiven 50. And Jesus says, you have judged correctly. Turning to the woman, he continues talking to Simon, but now turning to the woman, he says, do you see this woman? I mean, I know you saw her, but do you see her? Right? The answer to that, of course, is no. Simon didn't see her. Like he saw a sinful woman. He saw a woman of the city. He saw a woman that probably had no right to be in his house, certainly had no right, quote unquote, to be in the presence of Jesus. And now Jesus directs Simon's attention directly toward her. Do you see her? Simon, look at her. And then we had at the beginning here a comparison, I think, that Simon was making between him and the woman. Now Jesus is making a comparison between Simon and the woman. He says this, I entered your house and you gave me no water for my feet. But she, right now, Simon, when I came into your house, here's how you received me. You didn't give me any water for my feet, what might have been a pretty ordinary and customary measure of hospitality that a person who has invited somebody into their home might give. This gesture of hospitality. It says, you didn't do that. You didn't give me water for my feet, right? So in looking at the way in which you responded to me and she is responding to me, you gave me no water for my feet, but she, with her tears, has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, right? Again, a gesture of hospitality that a person who has invited another into their home would give. You gave me no kiss, but she hasn't stopped kissing. Not the gesture of a hospitable kiss on the cheek, like might be expected among people. She's been kissing. She hasn't stopped kissing my feet since she came in. You didn't anoint my head with olive oil, but she has anointed my feet with perfume. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. And that's why she loved much. That's really kind of the piece that we're going to focus on this morning. That's why she loved much. But the one who is forgiven little loves little. And then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Well, those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this man who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I want to talk about, first of all, a couple of ways in which the debtors in the story were different, right? Simon, the reason why the story comes about is because Simon, I believe, is making a comparison between himself and this woman. Now, that's not, he doesn't articulate that. I don't even know that he is, doing this as a conscious sort of comparison, but he's basically doing what we all do, right? When we see another person, we make comparisons between ourselves and that person. So Simon, the comparison that he's making, the contrast really, between him and this woman is clearly one that, Jesus couldn't possibly be okay with this woman coming near him, right? And Jesus now uses this, an opportunity to give this illustration about these debtors, right? In the story, the two debtors were different in what they owed, right? That is the difference between them. One owed 50, one owed 500. And here, that corresponds to Simon's contrast between himself and the woman. He couldn't imagine that Jesus would let this woman come near him. But at the same time, I bet you he couldn't have imagined that Jesus would have declined his invitation for him to come into his home to have a meal with him. Like when he sent the invitation to Jesus, there was no expectation whatsoever on his part that Jesus would decline. He thought for sure, I'm sure he assumed, of course Jesus would come and have dinner with me. Like who wouldn't, right? That's the way Simon saw himself. And he contrasts that with the way in which he understood Jesus would have seen the woman. So the two debtors were different in what they owed. However, while they were different in what they were owed, the two debtors were alike in this regard. Neither of them could pay back the debt that they owed, right? Remember in the story, right? The one owed 50, the one owed 500. It says the creditor forgave them both their debt for the reason that neither of them were able to pay back the debt. One owed a less significant amount than the other, but they were both in the same boat. Neither of them could pay back, right? There was no, the reality is it didn't matter that one owed 50 and that one owed 500. It didn't matter if that one that owed 50 owed 100. Like if you couldn't pay it back, you couldn't pay it back. Now, when we understand the economic system that we're kind of looking at here in Jesus' day, it's not like ours, right? You think about what you earn in a day. There's a really good chance that what you earn in a day, a portion of that could be used to cover your absolutely necessary survival expenses, right? Your food, shelter, and clothing, those things that you absolutely need in order to survive, right? But that's just a portion of what you earn in a day. Chances are you have, additional parts of that money that could be used for any number of things. Some discretionary, some bills maybe that you've incurred, perhaps even saving, right? But when we're talking about a laborer making a day's wages in Jesus' days, we're not talking about somebody that, could use half of what they made in the day to take care of the basic necessities, and then they could sock away 25% for retirement, right? And, another 10% for their emergency fund or anything like that. No, like what they made is what they needed in order to live that day, right? And then they'd work again the next day to make what they needed to live for that day. There was no extra kind of going around. So if you owed, if you were this person living under that kind of financial duress, really didn't matter if you owed 50 days worth of wages or 500. The fact that you had at some point incurred this debt put you in a position where you could not and probably could never pay it back. Right, so the two debtors were alike in that they couldn't pay the debt back, and then they're different again. In Jesus' story, the two debtors were different in how they responded. Right, the question comes: which of them do you suppose will love the creditor more? For one, in the story, forgiveness was the greatest gift. For the other, it was a gift, but perhaps a gift that was more taken for granted. Now, if you could just, we have to use our imaginations a little bit. Just let's imagine how this went down, okay? So you have the creditor. He calls in these two debtors that owe him these sums of money, right? And so you have the two here, the 500 and the 50. In the story, Jesus begins with the 500, right? So the creditor looks at the one who owes him 500 and says to that person, I forgive your debt. You don't owe me anything. You may go in peace. Your debt is wholly and forgiven. Imagine that very gesture of mercy, of grace. Just imagine what relief, what gratitude, what love, as Jesus describes here, must have been released in that person's heart. That person who had been living under the crushing weight of a debt that they knew they would never be able to pay. In fact, a debt that probably, if anything, would only get worse, perhaps leading them and their entire family ultimately into full indentured servanthood for the rest of their lives. Like they'd have to sell themselves into slavery if they weren't able to pay the debt. I mean, that's just how it worked. But now all of a sudden, for no reason, no particular reason other than the mercy of the creditor, he releases that person of their debt. It's washed away, wiped away. They walk out of there now owing nobody anything. Just imagine. And so in this scenario, the person who owes 50 is also standing there, watching this take place, right? They came into this meeting not knowing what was going to happen, probably assuming the worst, like, man, they're going to call my debt of 50 denarii. They're going to call it out right now. And I don't have it. I'll never have it. I'm done for. My family's done for, right? But now all of a sudden, there they are hearing how this one has been forgiven, 500. And, if that person who owes 50 is anything like you and I are, what's going on in their mind? How did that person ever get into that much trouble? Right? All of a sudden, that person who was probably walking in, with a certain degree of trepidation, worried, concerned about the fact that their debt might be called. Now, as this interaction is happening between the creditor and this one who owes 500, now all of a sudden they're like, my 50 doesn't look so bad after all, does it? Like, how did that, how irresponsible was this guy that got himself into 500 days worth of wages in debt? Man, oh man, I haven't exactly made the best financial decisions in my life, but nothing like this joker, right? Right? And so this comparison starts to be drawn. You know what else probably is going on in the heart and the mind of this person is? An assumption. What would the assumption be? if he forgave 500, it would only be fair, it would only be right for him to forgive 50, right? It's so funny how much angst there is, like all this news. I don't know exactly what's going on, and so my lack of information will probably betray But I just find it sort of funny, the parts of our government have promised tuition forgiveness, right? Or loan forgiveness for federal loans up to a certain level, right? And so you got some people really happy about that, some people who aren't so happy about that, right? Probably depends on the situation you're in. Here's this guy who was 50, now making assumptions, thinking about he's probably gone from walking in scared to go into this meeting to, oh my goodness, I guess my situation isn't so bad. Look how bad this person screwed up their lives. To, you know what? This guy probably owes me forgiveness, given how he's treated this other. I mean, after all, that would only be fair, right? Now, we all have a tendency of acting like that, thinking like that, viewing ourselves that way, right? The point of the story is it's not just in the degrees to which, these two different people owe different things, but the difference in how they responded, right? The one who, as Jesus is reflecting on the way in which Simon received him and the way in which this woman has received him, he sees two entirely different kinds of responses. Again, Simon, I entered your house and you gave me no water for my feet, but she with her tears has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but, right? All these buts. You gave me no kiss, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet since she came in. You didn't anoint my head with olive oil. I mean, olive oil, right? You got jars of it in your cupboard. I mean, olive oil, for somebody like Simon, I mean, that was a commodity. That was something easy to come by. But while you didn't anoint my head with oil, right? Again, this beautiful gesture of hospitality, she has anointed my feet with something that is precious, right? This perfume that she has brought in. There's a major difference between the way in which Simon and this woman had responded. Now, in using the way that I tried to kind of like illustrate how this story might have played out, one of the things that we need to understand when it comes to forgiveness, right? Like what actually was going on in the lives of both Simon and this woman, and what would have been probably a more appropriate response, especially on the part of Simon. One of the things that we have to understand is that the differences among us in our need for forgiveness, right? They're actually a mirage. See, I think we tend to be like Simon in that we can't help ourselves, but look around and weigh ourselves, measure ourselves up and against other people. Like, how do I stand up against this person? And how do I look when compared to this person, right? Better, worse? We can't help ourselves. And so in weighing ourselves, there is sometimes this assumed measure of worth that we bring, this measure of goodness that we bring, that, I don't know. I think some of us, when we think about whatever it is that we talk about that God has done for us or how God has forgiven us, I think a lot of times we just kind of take it for granted. Almost like this assumption like, well, yeah, I mean, that's, of course God would forgive me, right? Of course God would overlook, the stuff in my life. I mean, because after all, I'm not so bad. Right? But the differences between us that we perceive, they're actually a mirage. They're not really, like those differences are inconsequential because we're more alike in the fact that none of us can actually pay back to God the debt that we owe him. We are all exactly alike in that way. And so we are more alike in that sense than we are different in the way in which we see ourselves as we compare ourselves with one another. And I think that Jesus is trying to draw out of this that like the woman's response to what God had done in her life and what God did for her life, our response to forgiveness should look a lot more like hers than his. The way in which we respond to God when we really experience the gravity of what he has done, what he has accomplished, what he is doing, what he is accomplishing in our lives, our response should look much more like hers than his. And this kind of speaks to, and what we see being played out in the life of this woman is there is obviously this deep, earnest longing that she has for the presence of Jesus. You have on the one hand, this kind of official leader who invites Jesus into his home for a meal so that he can maybe kind of figure out a little better just who this Jesus is. Contrasted with this woman who stumbles her way in, weeping as she makes her way to the feet of Jesus, showing her desperation, demonstrating her longing, demonstrating that high degree of love and affection that she had toward this man, Jesus. What a difference. And today I want for us to wrestle a little bit with the question of does our love and affection for and devotion toward and gratitude for Jesus, does it look more like Simon's, or does it look more like this woman's? So we think about the Christmas story, right? Much of the Christmas story, that first Christmas, the arrival of the Messiah, was the fulfillment of the anticipation of what had been promised hundreds and hundreds of years before, right? The prophets had foretold the coming of the Messiah. And so for generations and generations, the people of God waited in anticipation and they longed for the Messiah to come. You know, when you celebrate Advent, sort of ceremoniously, right? Some of us do that. And one of the parts that we bring into our Advent experience is trying to reimagine for ourselves the earnest longing and desire that we have for the coming of the Messiah. One of the Christmas stories, parts of it goes like this. It says, entering the house, the wise men saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In another one of the gospel accounts, you have Jesus, the baby, being brought to the temple, right? And this man, Simeon, looks upon the face of the Messiah, the one that he in his own heart had been longing to see. And not only had been longing for it, but had been promised by God himself that he wouldn't see death until he had seen the arrival of God's promise. And now he says, Master, you can dismiss your servant in peace as you have promised, for my eyes have seen your salvation. The Christmas story is a story of longing and is so beautifully demonstrated in the life of this woman who came and sobbed at the feet of Jesus. Now, in asking ourselves this question, is my attitude toward, and is my affection for, and is my gratitude for Jesus, does it look more like Simon's or more like the woman's? If it looks more like Simon's, if we have this tendency to kind of downplay emotionally, mentally, spiritually, the reality of what God has done in our lives. If we have a tendency to sort of just kind of walk around with this air that, you know, intellectually I know what God did for me. But we walk around almost with this sort of I just kind of take it for granted. This gesture of forgiveness that God has given to me, this gesture of reconciliation, this gesture of bringing me into his family. If that's my problem, if my tendency is to look a little more like Simon when it comes to my worship and adoration for Jesus, I probably need a fresh revelation of God's holiness. What Simon needed was he needed to be reminded, right? Because he was making this comparison between him and the woman, right? And the comparison, as far as he was concerned, made him look really, 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 really good. But what Simon needed was a reminder of God's holiness that weighed him not against some other human being, but weighed him against the very holiness of God himself. How do I know if I need a fresh revelation of God's holiness? Well, think about the way in which you consider your sin, your sinfulness, your failures. If you're of the opinion that my sin, if we're even going to call it that, isn't so bad, there's a really good chance I need a fresh revelation of God's holiness. If I'm walking around weighing more considerably the good that I've done or the good life that I'm living with the feeling that's certainly enough to undo or overshadow the bad that I've done. Almost like, people are now, they're buying carbon credits, right? Trying to reduce their carbon footprint, not just by modifying their behavior, but by purchasing credits to offset the carbon impact that they're having in the world, right? Sometimes we do that as Christians with the way in which we consider the good of our lives, right? Well, I'm relatively speaking, I'm pretty good. I do a lot of good things. There are a lot of things for which I could be given credit. Certainly enough, so much that it overrides, it overshadows the bad that I've done. If that's my attitude toward my sinfulness, in view of how and where I stand in contrast to God, there's probably a chance I need a fresh revelation of God's holiness. You read in the scriptures, these moments where human beings had a personal encounter with God. And a lot of times we would think, if God were ever to show up, if God were ever to manifest himself, man, that'd be so cool. I just chummy right up to him and it's like, hey, dude, you know what? I got some questions. I'm so glad you're here, right? Do you know what you would do if God showed up? Do you know what you would do if the heavens opened and God revealed himself to you? You'd wet your pants to start, right? Right, there's a story, in the calling of Isaiah, right? Isaiah chapter 6. He says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, right? He begins to describe the scene in which he witnessed the very presence of God. And what does he do? He cowers in the presence of God. He says, woe is me. I'm undone. I am ruined. It is over. I am cut off from my people because I have seen the very presence of God. That's the way in which we would respond if we were actually given a glimpse of the holiness and the majesty of God, right? But the problem is we just don't see God that way. We have domesticated him so much. We have brought him so down to our level that we forget, when it comes to our sin, here's the reality of our sin that we need to understand today. My sin is an affront to God. My sin is an affront to God. It is an offense to God. My sin is. Not only is my sin an affront to God, my sin is it's an affront to the people that God has created in his image, including me, right? The Bible describes how our sin is an affront toward our neighbor. My sin in some cases can even be an affront to myself, right? Paul talks about sinning against one's own body, one against one's own self. So if my attitude happens to be more like Simon's, then there might be a good chance I need a fresh revelation of God's holiness. Now, there's another thing we might need to see better and differently. A lot of times people, they become so crushed under the weight of their sin that they almost feel as if there is no hope. Before this woman encountered and met Jesus, she was living in that kind of condition. She was living with that kind of despondency and hopelessness. She didn't understand what it meant to be loved. She didn't understand what it meant to be worth loving. She didn't understand what it meant to be welcomed into society. She didn't understand what it meant to be highly esteemed among her peers. But then when she met Jesus, everything changed. So if you're here this morning, or if you know somebody who is kind of dealing with the crushing weight of the failures of the past and the sin that just seems to be the thing that defines that person's, not only their past, but their future. It may be that you need a reminder of God's mercy. right? This story reminds us of the mercy that God extended toward a woman who everybody else would have cast her off aside as a hopeless cause, but whom God loved intensely. If your failures have you paralyzed, if you're in this place where you're just unable to hope for the future, for the past that has already been, if you're walking around and what other people are saying about you or what you perceive other people think about you is speaking more loudly to you than what God thinks about you, it just might be that you need a fresh reminder of God's mercy. So as we close this morning, as we, are now making our way into the kind of the final week of this Christmas season, I just want us to imagine a couple things. Number one, what if we longed for Jesus like this woman did? My guess is that many of us, the majority of us perhaps even, if we were really honest, we have way more of a tendency to be like Simon, right? Don't raise your hands, but would anybody care to admit that? Like if I was really, really honest, I could probably be described a lot more like Simon than I could like this one. But just what if that started to change? What if that started to change in your life? What if we longed for Jesus like this woman did? What would that change? What difference would that make? How would that change the nature of, our organization, our church? If you're a part of Curtis Lake Church, like if the collective longing for Jesus were being elevated in each of our lives, what difference would that make? Secondly, what if we worship Jesus like the woman worshiped Jesus? What if we, in understanding the full implications of what God has done for us, what God is doing for us, the very gift that he is to us, like what if we really started to experience that? What if we really started to see ourselves like the debtor who owed such a great debt, a debt that could never, ever, ever in any universe, in any scenario ever be paid, and it has been forgiven? What measure of love would that begin to produce in us? What if we began worshiping Jesus like this woman did? I'd never have to ask you to clap during a song ever again. Right? Now think about it. Think about, listen, I'm not looking, to be in an environment where everything's just like the circus and everything's just like so heavenly minded that there's no like practical reality for, how we're living our lives and how we're demonstrating the real gratefulness that we have for what God has done in our lives as we go out into the marketplace, to our workplaces, into our schools, and as we begin demonstrating this love that Jesus has poured into our lives, right? I'm not talking about like just trying to figure out how to, come together for an hour at a time, once a week, and having this like explosively emotional experience that really, ultimately has no real manifestation outside these walls. That's not what I'm talking about. But could our worship not use a little more heightened sensitivity to what God has done in our lives, what God is doing in our lives, the real gift that he is to us? Could we not grow in our worship and adoration for all who Jesus is? Amen. I'm going to invite you to stand. The band's going to lead us in a couple songs as we close out this morning. And as we do this, maybe this could just be a little practice for us today. Maybe this could just be a little warm up, again, as we play out the rest of this week, as we get ready in the busy and the hustle and the bustle of preparing for family and friends to come and to share a meal, and for kids and grandkids and friends and loved ones to open presents, and all that goes on, all those wonderful festivities that go on. Let's not forget that there's an opportunity for each of us to grow in our longing, to grow in our desire, to grow in our worship and adoration for this Jesus that, at least mentally, we know the season is all about anyway. So let's give him the worship and the praise and the adoration and the love and the affection that he deserves. Let's see if we can't grow to be more like the woman who's lost, like just beside herself, with affection toward Jesus, as she forgets everything that's going around her, forgets everybody who might see her, and just she loses herself at the feet of Jesus, sobbing, washing his feet with her tears, drying them with her hair, anointing his feet with that perfume, demonstrating that the reality of what she has been forgiven of, the reality of what God has done in her life, it now produces a reaction of great, great, great love. I pray that love would start to come and ooze out of each of us as well. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much, first of all, for the gift that we celebrate this Christmas season. The story of how you have entered into our world. You became like as we are. You walked among us and you revealed the true nature and character of all that God is, so that we could know you more personally than we ever could have otherwise. Lord, I thank you for that gift. I thank you that you left a mark. You left an imprint on this world and in each of our hearts and lives. And I pray that you would help us to not quickly forget the reality of what you have done for each of us. God, as we consider and weigh the value of what you have forgiven us of, when we weigh and value the hope for the future that you have given to each of us, God, may it just produce in us a life of worship and adoration and affection for you. I pray that the love that comes forth would not be the kind of love that continues to separate between these and those, that continues to make contrasts and comparisons between us and them. But Lord, it helps us to see ourselves in light of you and respond in turn to the great gift of who you are in our lives. Help us to be willing to share that gift with others as you bring them into our lives. And so, Lord, we just take a few moments now to worship and adore you. In Jesus' name.